Hello! In this video I'm going to walk you through my process for creating this shadowy sphere ink drawing. I'm creating this drawing in response to the prompt shadow for Mindfultober 2023, but you definitely don't need to be doing Mindfultober to be following along. So the great thing about this particular drawing is it's a really fantastic little exercise to learn all about creating shadows with ink hatching, and a really important fundamental skill which can be very tricky for beginners to pick up with shading, which is something called directional mark making, which I'm going to talk you through. So to follow along, you'll need some paper, you'll need a pencil, an eraser, a pen to draw with, and this needs to be something that won't smudge because you're going to erase the pencil underneath later, and something circular to draw around, or a compass if you have one. I'm just going to use this roll of sellotape. So I'm going to be working from this reference photograph, which is a royalty-free photo from Unsplash, which I've linked to down below if you'd like to follow along with the same image. So first we are going to draw our circle on our paper. So you can draw around your circular object or use your compass to create a circle. Making sure that you have enough space to consider the shadow underneath your sphere. So you may want to figure out if you want to use your paper in a landscape or portrait orientation, depending on how big your circle is, thinking about this shadow here, this one that goes underneath. Doesn't matter if it goes off the edge of the paper, but actually if I turn my paper landscape, I can actually fit the whole shadow in, so it may look a bit more natural if I do it that way. So one of the big challenges with drawing from an image like this is that it is so simple that our brain thinks it knows it. It goes, aha, that is just a sphere or a ball with a shadow, and it kind of fills in the gaps for you without allowing you to really carefully observe where the shadows are and how to apply them. So before we begin, I want you to just spend some time looking at this reference photo, and it can actually help, if you want to turn it upside down just so that it feels a bit more different. It can just slightly confuse your brain and just prevent it from jumping in and telling you exactly where all the shadows are. But we're just going to spend some time just looking at it and observing where the different types of shadow are, where they're darkest, where they're lightest, and what the shapes are. So what we're looking for are the areas of shadow and the shapes those shadows are making. And this takes a little bit of focused attention because this is a white sphere with a white background, so it's all quite subtle, but if you really look for them, you can see there is a very strong diagonal line, for example, across here. I'm going to draw on this photo. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but there's quite a strong curved diagonal there, which is sort of the border for this shape of shadow. And there's a kind of squashed oval here where that really light area is. And we've also got a couple of other squashed ovals here and here of very light areas too. There's also a very strong, very squashed oval making up the shadow of the sphere on the table, but we need to look a bit harder for the nuances within all these shadows too. So what we're doing right now in looking at this image is mindful observation. So we're not just taking one look at it and deciding that, you know, the light's coming from the top right and there's a big shadow going across the middle, but we're really taking our time to observe carefully the nuances of shadow within that. And this takes a little more time and patience than we may sometimes allocate to observing our drawing subject. But trust me, this will lead to a way more successful drawing when we come to start drawing in a moment. Okay, so within that light area, I'm also noticing some difference between the very lightest area and the area going down the sides. So you can see there's sort of here and here. It's kind of almost a crescent moonish shape where that is a bit lighter. So it's the lightest, and then it's a bit lighter still, and then there's a sort of darker band in the middle here, leading to this quite strong diagonal. So if we sort of start to define those shapes on the photo, this is going to help us when we come to start shading. So I would say that the very strong dark shadow is almost in a triangular shape. It's a bit softened on the edges, but I can simplify that into a sort of triangle shape. And I can also see that where those two lightest areas are, there's an area around those where you would say they're slightly different shapes, but they are sort of light, but not as light as the very sort of bright area. There's a similar subtle difference in the shadowy area too. So if we define those shapes on our photo, this can be quite helpful when we get to the shading part. Now, I just want to explain what directional mark making is and why it's so important. Now, directional mark making, very simply, is marks, in our case shading lines, which go in a direction which helps to communicate the shape and volume of an object. Now, one of the biggest mistakes I see with beginner drawers is that they approach a drawing like this and use shading lines which go in a direction which, let's call it, could be random. So they might shade kind of straight across from left to right, for example. And what that does is it kind of confuses us, because the direction of those lines don't really help to describe the shape of the object. When we come to start shading, I want you to imagine that this sphere is made up of, let's call it a wire frame. And that frame can act as a template for how we should be directing our hatching lines. And if we do that, we will way more successfully communicate the object's form, and the whole thing will look more three-dimensional. So I'll show you what I mean just by sketching it on the back. So say this is our sphere. The thing that I often see beginners doing, which can really flatten something that they're shading, is they'll do hatching lines like this, which are straight. You know, it's something that we've been taught to do, is to create these sort of straight hatching lines. But it just doesn't help to describe the overall shape. So if we imagine that our sphere is made of a wireframe, like this. When we then start shading, if we can follow the direction of these lines, this is going to help us far more successfully communicate the sort of shape and volume of this particular object. Now, thinking about our specific reference, because the photo is coming from the top right, if we just tilt our frame toward the light source, it's going to mean that our directional shading lines will more easily align with this very strong diagonal line that we have going across the centre, which is going to make things a bit easier when we come to shade. Now, when you're thinking about a wireframe on an object, we've also got to bear in mind some other things like perspective and how we're looking at the object, whether we're at eye level with it or looking down on it. With this particular image, our eye level is quite low. We can tell that from what we can see in the background. And so this line here, it actually makes sense. If we imagine the back of that, if we could see all the way through it, the way that that is positioned actually will work pretty well. So what we're going to go for, say the light source is coming from up here, and you can see that line is curved. That actually makes sense with our eye view. So the wireframe, so our eye level might be somewhere here, and that's where it would be straight. and it's going to get more curved. As it goes away from us. Like this. So you can see that the curve here, that is pretty much going to align, pretty much going to align with this very strong shadow. So that's going to be helpful when we start shading. So thinking about starting to do a very light sketch now of that kind of wireframe on my example. I'm not going to draw both sides of the wireframe, as if you can see the front of the sphere and the back of it, just because it can get confusing because those angles change. I'm just going to draw an axis line, so that reminds us where the light is coming from. And it's this particular line which makes a lot of sense, because if we could see the back of it, it would be kind of going that way, but I'm not going to draw that. And as we get toward the top, those lines will get slightly closer together and more curved, and they get straight in the middle, because our eye level, if you imagine we're looking at this sphere at eye level, we can actually see that we're very low to it because of the way that the angles of the background are shown. So our eye level would be about here on the sphere. So we're going to have a straight line around here, and then it will start to curve the other way. Think of it a bit like a beach ball, and you've sort of got the idea. We can also think about the other axis as well. So if we're thinking about that would be our straight line. That's where our kind of eye level is. And we would have this sort of effect from our beach ball. So more spread out in the middle, and as they go towards the centre, they get a little closer together nearer the edge. Something like that. I hope you can see that on camera, because it's I've drawn it in quite lightly. It doesn't matter how many sort of horizontal and vertical lines you draw on your wireframe. We're going to erase them later, so try and keep them nice and light. These are just there to act as guidelines for the direction of your shading. So now we have our framework lightly sketched in, we can also sketch in the shape of the shadows and highlights that we've just identified when we were mindfully observing our reference image, which will give us a really clear map to begin our shading. So we've already got this, it's that curved line that is the very dominant shape across there. We've also got that area of very light, got another area very light here, and then we've got the slightly larger sort of mid-light areas. And stay the darkest area really sort of almost forms a triangle. Feels quite triangular there. And I also want to sketch in the shape of the shadow as well, which is underneath. So quite elongated. Because we're almost at eye level with the table, that shadow is very, very narrow. And I may not actually use them very much, but I'm just going to put these lines in which show where the planes of the, let's call it a room, it could just be a box that this sphere is photographed in, but I just want to have those to refer to. That's actually a little bit too angled. It's almost horizontal, but not quite this one. So one thing which is really, really important when you're approaching a drawing like this is to not outline your circle in pen. Now, this is something that we often instinctively do because it's the edge of our object, but this immediately flattens it. And we're hoping to make this look very three-dimensional by the way we shade it, so please avoid outlining your circle in pen. So I like to start with the lighter areas first. The very lightest areas I'm just going to leave completely white, the colour of the paper. So I'm going to start with these sort of shapes that aren't these three ovals here. I'm going to take my pen, and I'm not going to be just shading these areas because with shading we can layer it up. So I'm going to be shading everything except this oval, this one and this one here. And I'm going to start by using these lines from my wireframe. Because they are the directional lines. So I'm stopping at the edge of those light shapes. So we obviously have two choices here of which direction to go in, whether we're following the horizontal or vertical grid lines, and either of them will work. There is sometimes one direction which would be in some ways easier or more clearly describe the form of the object we're drawing. If there doesn't seem to be one way in particular, just pick one. It really doesn't matter which one. So you may need to keep moving your paper around to get these curves in a way that's feeling comfy for you to draw, because usually you want your hand to be inside the curve. For the darker shadowy areas, you'll be using both directions, but I would just start with one for the lighter areas and then we'll build it up gradually. So I'm keeping my lines quite light and they'll be reasonably spaced apart too. Of course, the closer the lines are together, it gives a darker effect, which will suggest darker shadow. So they will get closer together near the sort of edges of the sphere to help suggest that depth and where the shadows become darker. Remember, you can always build up more shadow, whereas you can't remove it once you've inked it. So start gently. So next I'm going to look for the slightly darker areas and introduce more shading, which is still going to follow this grid structure, but it could be that we begin to use both directions. And the lines could also start getting a bit closer together. So I've got this sort of lightish area. So the bit that I want, there's kind of a sort of crescent here. So I'm going to start using, it makes more sense to me to use this direction now. And when you start shading, you do want to be aware of how these the grid underneath, how the direction of that is working, because it will impact on the directional mark making will impact on how three-dimensional everything is looking. So because the shadow is coming down, I'm going to keep going. And this is where the shape is getting more straight, and then it's going to start curving the other way. So this is why I only drew the front of my wireframe, because if you've got all of it drawn in, it can get a little bit confusing at this stage when you've got so many overlapping lines. I'm going to keep working like this until I've got the darkest shadowy parts of the sphere. Once I've inked this, I may need to go back to some of the lighter areas to add a bit more hatching. And at that point, I may also want to rub out my pencil marks just to make it clearer how that is looking, how the tonal value is working. So I'm coming back now to work on the middle and this much darker shadowy area. So the shadows are not harsh really anywhere on my sphere, so I'm trying to, although I'm working with those pencil shapes that I drew, I'm then sort of trying to blend them a bit by not making the sort of edges of the shadows feel too harsh or a particular shape. So keep going back to your original photograph just to keep observing, because obviously when we started observing and finding the shadows, we just simplified those into some shapes. But if you look, there are nuanced areas. So there's kind of a little bit of a very faint shadow in there. So I'm just going to add a bit of that. Something to look out for is the very edges of your sphere. So because we don't want to outline your sphere, which will kind of flatten it, we do want to make sure that where we begin any shading lines and hatching, they're quite accurately on the very, very edge of that pencil line, because it will just really help to describe that kind of circular shape later. So if you feel like you haven't quite got some of your shading lines starting on the very edge, just go back and just pay attention to maybe starting filling in those gaps. If you have some gaps between where a shading line starts and the very edge, really will help to make it feel more complete and 3D. So at this point, it can be helpful to erase some or all of your pencil marks from the sphere. Just leave the shadow and the background marks in, just so that you can clearly see the effect that you're creating, because sometimes when there's a heavy build-up of lots of different marks and also the very edge of your sphere, it can be hard to sort of check whether it's working. So I'm just going to erase my pencil at this stage. So now I want to tackle the shadow under the ball, and this is another area where choosing the right direction of our hatching makes the world of difference. I often see beginners shading in all sorts of direction within shadows, and honestly it can end up ruining an otherwise really awesome drawing. So my best tip for shading with shadows is to use mostly, if not all, horizontal lines. Now, the reason shading shadows can be so tricky is that we need to have a really good grasp of the perspective going on in the image to get any other directional marks to feel right, whereas horizontal lines will always look right because they make the object feel grounded on the surface. So be careful to pay very close attention to the point where your object and its shadow meet. We need to really closely observe here because sometimes the light patterns here can be surprising. You notice, for example, that there's a really dark bit, but there's a tiny gap that there's only actually a very small amount where the very darkest bit underneath that sphere hits the very darkest bit of the shadow. Notice within this shadow that there is also a darker area and a slightly lighter area too. So this should affect how closely together your hatching lines are. The other thing we can try to represent in our drawing is where the shadow is defined with a clear and harsher edge, and where it's more blurred and subtle. So you can see it's very clear and defined here, but much more subtle at the other end where it's further away from the object and light source. So where it's more blurred, we want to use slightly different lengths to our lines to create that effect, whereas the more defined, clearer edge will have a more obvious shape to your shading. So something else to bear in mind for straight lines, the other thing that can come up a lot that I see with beginners especially, is that in trying to draw a straight line, you end up drawing a curved line in shadows because it's our natural shape. Especially if we're leaning our hand on the table, it's like a pivot and it creates this kind of arc. So if you just lift your wrist off the table and just try and draw a really horizontal line, it doesn't need to be perfect, but you just don't want that repeating curve to every line that you do, because it will end up making everything look like not quite right. Now the shadow is very dark, so we're going to end up with a lot of horizontal lines. I'd need to define and do a bit more shading on my sphere, because I've realised that it wasn't quite dark enough. Oops, that was the wrong angle. Just paying really close attention here to observing . So you can obviously do shorter horizontal lines as well if you need to sort of create more of a shape. So background, this is another area, much like the shadow, that can really spoil an otherwise great drawing if you shade it in random directions. And it can also help to really make your drawing pop as well. So it's quite important. So in an image where you can't see a horizon line denoting the edge of the table or surface, which we do actually have here, it is in the shadow, but there's actually two horizon lines because our object is in a corner. But if you don't have that, I would always use vertical lines when shading a background, possibly adding in some horizontal ones as well if you need to make it darker. Now in this image we can actually see a corner, so there are two kind of planes to consider. They're not perfectly horizontal, they're going at slight angles to the horizontal. So we can use both vertical lines and lines which are parallel to the planes shown here. So lines parallel to this one for this part of the background, and lines parallel to that one for this part of the background. Bear in mind that the plane on the left is darker than the plane on the right, so your shading should reflect that. Now, I don't want to completely fill my paper with shading, but just having some shading around the object can just really help to make it pop out from the background. Specifically, where I'm thinking about is in the areas where I've left the object completely white, so we don't have that definition of the circle there. Pay particular attention to the shading lines of the background there being exactly at the right spot to describe that curve and that shape. And remember, do not under any circumstances outline your sphere. That is totally going to ruin your shading effect at this point. So I can still very faintly see my pencil line even though I have rubbed it out, and I'm going to start at that pencil line and make the lines go up. So we're using doing it this way, starting at the sphere and going up. I know I've got more control then over where those lines begin. Now I just need to tidy up that edge because I just missed a bit of the shading there. So I'm going back in to do a second layer. And this is actually the darkest part of the background, so I will want to have some other lines as well, which are going to be parallel to this one here. Now this one is very close to the horizontal, so I'm going to be making it look pretty much horizontal. So again, I'm going to go in really carefully to that edge between my sphere and the background, just to make sure that I'm treating the shape very carefully. And that's where that hits my horizon, so I need to be very careful here between my light spot and that horizon line. So my background is darker than my sphere, so I'm working in quite a few layers, going horizontally and vertically, and I'm just being quite careful near the sphere itself. I mean, it almost looks solid in some places where I'm building up so many layers of shading, and that's fine. You have to be quite patient with this style of shading because it can take quite a long time to build up the tonal values that you need. Okay, so for this other plane, I just need to adjust that pencil line because I think I've drawn the angle a little bit too sharp. It's a bit closer to the horizontal than that. Something a bit gentler, like this. And I'm going to create this slightly lighter in tonal value than this side. You can see there's a bit of a difference there. I'm going to use that as a starting point. I'm just going to need to re-sketch my circle edge in just to help me get those finishing points off. Just to help me get the starting points of my shading lines. So when you've got to a point like this, it's a good idea just to keep having another look at your reference photo again, because it will start to become clear where you need to maybe make some little changes. So for example, I feel as though I need to darken down this middle shadow, this sort of triangular shape in the middle, because it's actually, I think, even darker than the background. And at the moment it's looking a bit lighter, so I'm just going to add another layer of hatching into there, just to hopefully get that darkening down a bit. And it's really just a case of just tweaking now. So we've got the structure in, we've got the shapes, we've got most of the shadows in, so now we can just refine and make it all come to life. Okay, so here we go. I hope you enjoyed this and found you were able to relax through the drawing process and really get into the mindful way of observing. If you're taking part in Mindfultober, then please share your drawing and tag both Shelley and myself on Instagram. If you're not taking part in Mindfultober, then I'd still absolutely love to see your drawing. So feel free to tag me on Instagram, or why not come and join my Facebook community for mindful drawing and learning to draw, and share your work there. It's a really lovely, warm and supportive group. If you enjoyed this video, it would be awesome if you could hit the thumbs up button and also subscribe to my channel, where I'll be sharing more content like this. Thanks for joining me, and I hope I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.